Through this short series, we've seen Jesus do some amazing things, perform great miracles, and surprise people constantly at what his message was and who it was relevant to. But now he's confronted with, in many ways, what is the last great enemy, with death. And he uses this as an opportunity for mission as well. Why do I say that? Because he says to his disciples at one point, this is happening the way it is so that you're able to see the power of God at work. And he's touching on something that in some ways we all confront and face, but there's more going on. If we just skip to the fact that this is about death and the resurrection, then we miss the fact that this is a very human story, because woven into it are the feelings that so many of us have. There's a reason why films and art to do with time travel are so popular, the likes of Back to the Future, because we all know what it is at some point to wonder if we could go back and do things differently, then we would feel better about somehow the present. Perhaps we could change things that we regret and did wrong, or perhaps we would just like a little more time with those that we love. And this passage is saturated in all those kinds of very human feelings, particularly from those who are dealing with loss through it. And so what I wanted to do was not skip past that. Ultimately, the story of Lazarus and Jesus, but also the story of Jesus and the Bible, is going towards resurrection. As I said to the young people, if you skip right to the book at the end, it's about everything being resurrected and renewed. This entire creation that you and I experience, with all of its suffering, frustration, anguish, and pain, all of that being renewed and made good by God. But I think the Gospels unfold in such a way as to give us some resources that we can resonate with and believe in while we are on that journey and while we await that future of God wiping every tear from our eyes. So I want to look at these 3 points. Firstly, in accepting our limitations, because I think that's what people in the story have to do. Secondly, in embracing the empathy that Jesus gives us. And thirdly and lastly, in trusting in the resurrection. Accepting our limitations. Now, Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha are known to Jesus. They're friends. They've got previous history, and they exist in this little town called Bethany. Bethany is translated something like house of the poor or house of the sick, and some historians think it's very possible this is where sick people went, perhaps for respite or even palliative care. And so we are down in the weeds with sickness, darkness, and suffering. And so he decides that he will go there. But notice in verse 6, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days, and then said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. Now that's such an interesting detail. Why does he choose to do that? Because he knows that he's the Son of God. He ostensibly knows how sick Lazarus is. He ostensibly knows that like any situation that we face, the quicker that you react to something when someone is not well or dying, then the better the outcomes are. And yet, he decides to stay there. His ways are in many ways inscrutable. And we find that confusion later on, because Martha says to him when he gets there, Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And so they make that logical connection, that, if you like, he's hung around. Now, there's a couple of things that are important from our very human point of view. And the first is, in accepting our limitation, we realize that we are not God. And I know that that sounds obvious, but accepting that God is actually beyond our control, our manipulation, that we're actually unable to make him do anything. Now, that doesn't mean the prayer isn't effective or that we don't ask God to do things, but that's actually what sets the God as we find him in the Bible. It sets him apart from nearly of every other faith tradition, and certainly a lot of modern spirituality, is that we can't push and bend and yield him. We can't send up certain kinds of offerings that'll change his mind and basically make him do what we want. That's what a lot of the spirituality, the people of the Bible are warned against in the Bible is, do not try and manipulate the gods, and do not try and manipulate God to get him to do what you want. But my friends, there's actually a real freedom in that, because once you realize that, then you can rest in his governance of things and accept your place as one who is not God. And we're not cut out or qualified for the job. And we worship a God who, I think, thankfully, is sovereign and is outside of us and cannot be manipulated by anyone. But then also, it's to embrace the fact that often in that world and life, we are going to be surprised at the way things turn out, and sometimes in a bad way. Martha says to him, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Sometimes we will be baffled by why God has allowed the things that have happened in our lives to have unfolded. And that's such a common and a universal experience. And I get asked all the time, why did God allow this? Why does God more generally allow awful things to happen, kids to get sick? I don't have an answer to that, so I don't pretend that I do, because only God allows. But let me give you one helpful pointer with that. That actually assumes that we have limitless knowledge, because that assumes that there can't be a good reason for anything happening the way it does because we can't think of one. But if you think about who God is and his limitless knowledge compared to ours, then it's reasonable that there might be some things that he knows that we don't. And it's hard for us to get into that mystery. So what's the key for you and I to walk through this life when we are baffled and confused and surrounded by mystery and not sure, and what seems to us good people seem to die and bad people seem to get to live long, happy and prosperous lives? All those confusing questions are wrestled with in the Bible. And here's what I think the key is to that, accepting those limitations in this passage. Jesus tells this little riddle in the first part where he says, anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. Now, that confused me when I read it this week, but here's what I think he's saying. What does Jesus sometimes call himself? The light of the world. We've thought about that, okay? Following Jesus and trusting in him is the way to navigate through this confusing, often dark, and often disappointing world. He's offering himself as a path to follow. He's not saying you're going to get all the answers. He's not saying that you will start to understand the will of God perfectly. But he is saying there will be a path with some light that can get you from day to day, and you can follow. And I think that's good news. It reminds me of, the poem that King George the Fifth read when they were going into World War II, and in his New Year's address, there was that line that says, put your hand into the hand of God, and that shall be safer to you than a known way. Accepting our limitations is so important, but that doesn't mean that we accept total darkness, because Jesus himself offers us a path through even our very limited human experience. And then embracing Jesus' empathy, we find that not only are people free here to castigate Jesus for what he's done wrong, but Jesus has his own reaction when he sees what's going on, when he sees the death that he's surrounded by. When Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Now just think about this for a minute, how amazing this short passage is. Jesus is the Son of God. And he has come into a situation where there is a death, where people are mourning the loss of a loved one. And that verb, what he says, he's deeply moved in his spirit, translation could be much stronger, because it's something like he's enraged. He's angry at death because of its interruption into the goodness of our lives and our experience and into God's good creation. And that's the way death is always characterized in the Bible. But not only that, he empathizes and relates to those who are suffering. Lazarus was likely his friend. And so Jesus, the Son of God, places himself with these kinds of limitations where he's going to feel the sorrow and the loss of what it is to lose friends through the sting of death. So he empathizes with them. And here's what jumped out to me at this in our human experience. One is that his empathy even extends to handling some accusations. Martha basically says to him, why didn't you come and do something about this? She shakes her fist. Have you ever done that? Have you ever shaken your fist at the heavens and at God? I was brought up in a tradition where it was thought of as really wrong to do that, because we just need to accept God's will and sovereignty in all circumstances. And I still kind of believe, fine, but there's a process to doing that. And you know what Jesus does is he shows us the importance of grief and the importance of processing that grief, because he takes part in that process himself. He gives others space to do it, and he's also big enough and secure enough in the love of God to handle questions, to handle doubts about the way he's doing things. And I think this is possibly the most practical application that we can make from this. I would encourage you, whatever your grief, your disappointment, your sorrow is, to take it to Jesus, to be honest at how annoyed and frustrated you are at him for the way things have played out, and to ask him to do something. And then allow yourself to be surprised by what he does, because everyone in this story gets a surprise. And I don't know what the surprise will be for you. I don't know what that'll look like. But what I can promise you from walking on this road with Jesus and taking my own frustrations and grief and anger to Jesus is that he does work in your life, and he does change things and give answers. I'll give you a couple of examples, one perhaps more salient than the other. First one was when I was in university. I was doing an English degree, and I thought I wanted to be an English teacher. Really thought I wanted to be an English teacher. And there was a course where if you went on to it, you could do the 2-in-1, English and teaching, and you'd be done in 4 years. Otherwise, I'd have had to do a postgrad. I tried and tried and tried to get onto that course, and it never happened. It was always oversubscribed. And I was annoyed, because I thought, well, why am I being prevented from doing what I need to do? It turns out I went into a career in broadcasting. I stopped my degree early. I loved that. And then about a year into my career, I thought, I would hate to be an English teacher now, because I knew myself better. And maybe God knew me better. Give you perhaps a more poignant example to the kind of human issues that we're facing is Victoria and I were quite open about it. We were unfortunate enough to have 2 miscarriages in a row. We had 3 altogether, but we had 2 back-to-back at one time. And we were at our wits' end, and we thought, is there any point in continuing to try to have more of a family, because the pain and the grief is so real. And I'll be honest with you, I was shaking my fists at the heavens, and I was considering, what's the point in even following God? And when other people tell me their stories that make them question God, I can understand that, because I know it's not rational, and I know God doesn't exist just to make my life unfold the way I would like it to. But I experienced that feeling. Now, our twins are what's called rainbow babies. They're here as a blessing that God gave to us after that. And that's not me guaranteeing anything. I'm just giving you some examples of my shaking my fists at the heavens and then being surprised at what God does and how that unfolds. And I urge you to do the same, because Jesus invites you in this story to do the same, to bring your pain, your anger, your grief. Do you know why? Because he has empathy. He is not a million miles away in the sky. He is the one who came to earth as a human being to suffer every grief and anguish which we bear. He suffered everything that you know to the utmost depth, and he understands what it feels like, and he wants you to bring it to him, and he wants to work in your life through that grief that you may process it. And then finally and lastly is trusting in the resurrection. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So Jewish belief this is where we get it from as Christians, was that at the end of the world, there would be a last day and God would rise everyone from the dead to be judged and then to go to their eternal resting place. That's what they believed even back then, apart from some groups like the Sadducees. And so Martha is going, yeah, I know what you're talking about, Jesus. He will rise then, the same as we all will, and that's good. And Jesus says, no, there's something in the here and now. There's an emblem, a part of that future resurrection that I am bringing into the present reality, into your present reality. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Common words we read at a funeral. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? How do you take part in this life that Jesus has to give? The life that starts now, that goes on forever, and the quality of it is the very life of God himself within us. How do you do that? The one who believes in me. And this is the simplest point of the gospel that is so simple that we often miss it or stumble over it or go around it. The life of Jesus that he promises to all of us now and forever is accessed by faith, by believing. He's asking Martha in this moment, do you believe that I am the one that God has sent? And she says, yes, of course. And he asks all of us, do you believe that I am the one whom God has sent? And do you know what happens when we do believe that he's come and that he's given himself and died for our sins? We experience the reality of him having given himself for us. Because finally, look at how good a God he is. Do you know what Jesus has done in order to do this miracle and show that he's the resurrection? He wanted to go to Bethany, but it's not far from Jerusalem. And they say to him, a short while ago there, the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back? In order to give Lazarus life and raise him, and to give Mary and Martha and everybody watching that hope and that belief, he not only risks his own life, he walks towards his own certain death. And that's a perfect picture of the gospel, because ultimately Christ walks into and embraces death that you and I might live. He gives himself that by us believing in him, we might know what it is to have the life of God within us, starting now and going on forever. You see, this is not about just a miracle or a magic trick. It is about God coming and saying, through Jesus, I am the resurrection and the life. It's not a thing. It's not just an event. It is a person that I am offering to you. And he's offering to give us connection and relationship to him. That yes, we might find days that are obscure and dark and we're not sure which way is up because of what we're going through. But he offers to be a light to our path. And yes, we will experience grief and heartache in a fallen world. And that can cause us so much difficulty and suffering. But he offers us to go through that with us and to help us process it as one who has also been through it, even though he is God. And finally, he offers us himself, dying on a cross instead of us to pay for our sins, but then also being united with us by faith, whereby we can know him with us every single day of our lives and into eternity. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.